Hi there. I'm Louisa Higgins, Arts Administrator for Riverside County Office of Education, and I'm sharing with you this presentation that I created for public health. And actually, I gave this talk to, I want to say, 35 or so epidemiologists that work in the Riverside County area. And what they had asked me to do was make a connection or make a case for how the arts and public education also affect our public health. So one is happening early on in life and one is happening down the road. So we were just trying to make that connection. So here's what I came up with. First of all, I led with this quote that I had found around about the time I was about to do this presentation. And it was about how we are busy trying to save people when they're older, but what about going upstream and seeing where the problem really begins? And so, as someone who works in education and working with students from as young as 3 to 18 or 19, what are some of the things that we can identify earlier, work on earlier, make happen earlier for people so that they're more successful and, in fact, healthier later in life? So that was my frame of reference. So my agenda for this short presentation, it's not very long at all, I think maybe 20 minutes, is a brief introduction to my background, talking about knowing your why do we do what we do in education and in public health, the philosophical foundations and lifelong goals that are found in the new art standards that we work with, some stories from the field. So I've been working in the arts for over 16 years and in education for over 30. So I have some real life stories that I think are relevant to making the case for the arts and public education. And then I very explicitly make connections from school to later life. And I have some closing reflections for you. So a little bit about my background, and I'm actually covering up my picture here, but I am currently an artist and poet. Those are practices that I continue from my childhood into my adult life. My first career was as an interior designer, so I was always very mindful about how our environment affects us. And then I've become an educator and finally an administrator, but even more importantly, an advocate. So in my role for Riverside County, I'm always advocating for arts for everyone and how we can promote and expand the arts. So that's a little bit about me and who I am. And like I was mentioning in the agenda, I think it's really important to know your why. So someone like me who's been in the field for 30 years, like, how do I still know why I'm here? Why do I do what I do? And I try and revisit that yearly, especially since we've had so many changes with COVID and kind of the reordering of education. Why? I really think on that. So I'd like to share a video with you that I think speaks to that really well. So here we go. All right. Isn't that an interesting video? I really never get tired of watching it because I think it really tells you, you can do your job and you can be very proficient and you can be skilled. But if your heart is in it, you're passionate about it, you know what your North Star is and where you're going, then that's next level. And so that's what happened in that particular video. So that's a really good personification of that happening. So the next thing I want to share with you is something that's really, I think, become very important in the arts. And this is part of the new standards. And these are our philosophical foundations and lifelong goals. And the reason, as an educator, that really grabs me is the philosophical foundations, or the why. Like, they're the underpinnings of why we're teaching the arts. And then the lifelong goals is really what we hope for our students long after they've left us, that those foundational pieces have carried on being right. And so the 6 aspects are communication. Arts is communication. The arts is creative personal realization, culture, history, and connectors, the arts as well-being, and the arts as community engagement. And finally, and very obviously, the arts as a profession. So you can see those are 6 different reasons or whys that we teach the arts, and all of them are important. They are not mutually exclusive. I'm very fond of one of them that I'll share with you why in a minute, but I think you can look at several or all of them at the same time and say, wow, I really see the rationale and the reason for why we're going to teach the arts because of this particular aspect. So on a personal note, when my son was 13, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and we went for treatment at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. And as you can imagine, that was an incredibly stressful time. I was really in grief because I was afraid he was going to pass. And I had 2 other children I was raising at the time. And so all this is going on for me. And I found that they had a huge private art collection in the hospital. And so for me, I would walk around in between things and look at these big, beautiful pieces of art. And I had respite, I had solace. And I didn't know this at the time, but we are wired both to behold art and also to make art. So by beholding, I felt better, my brain felt better, my emotions were more in check. And so I came home from that experience, and I will tell you that my son, this is a picture of him as an adult, is alive and well, thank you very much. But I came back and I started a mural program, and we had over 100 murals in Palm Springs Unified Schools by the time I was done. So there's a picture on the left, that's a big mural that covers 2 walls that was done at Cathedral City High School. And I also began painting personally. And I had to get up around the clock to medicate my son. And so I would go into the garage and paint. And I wasn't very good, and it really didn't matter because all of this emotion and things I was experiencing were transformed into these paintings. And over time, this is a recent painting that was Midway, which I actually sold, of Medusa, but over time it got better and so on. But that really wasn't the point. The experience of putting paint to canvas and having that time just for myself was really the arts as well-being. So the arts of my youth came back in my 40s to help me through that journey. So that is a personal story about how my personal life or my personal experiences ended up setting a trend for work we were doing in schools as well as what I was doing as an artist. The next story from my background is about Lady Lead. And so I had, excuse me, some tours going to schools. And when I would show up at the middle schools, the principals would say to me, "Oh, thank goodness you're here." And I thought they were really excited about the art. When in fact, and it was a tour I was doing that was 2 female artists, actually an author and an illustrator. They were excited that I was doing programming that was specifically aimed at girls. And they were telling me a lot of the horror stories around girls, overexposure in social media, over-sexualization, just lots of things that were really troubling. And so I went back to the drawing board and I was researching, what a single-sex art experience might look like. And I came up with a community art table, which is a big long table where everyone's kind of working around it. Think like the old quilting bees, that type of situation, because it's very social and it's very natural kind of environment for conversation for girls. And so I hired, and you can see there's my first 3 artists, hired young female artists that were really relatable and just very cool and just really outstanding young ladies. And so we started this a program called Lady Lead, and this was before #MeToo got started. So we saw what a profound effect this program had. And it was interesting. I think the first class we were set up like, oh, we're going to have several card tables and 5 kids at each table, and we'll serve 45 kids. And the first school we went to, we were overwhelmed by over 200 students that wanted to work with us. So I learned fast from that experience. But again, seeing how the arts could have a transformative effect on empowerment and how students were feeling about themselves. So after that, led to Boys Arts Mentoring, because boys were asking me, well, why aren't you doing something for us? And I thought, I'm not sure what I should do, because I felt really comfortable setting up a girls program. So I had realized that sitting in administration meetings, we were really talking a lot about young men of color and the suspension and expulsion rate. So I asked my boss, I said, can I make a program for boys centered around this issue? And so I spent a lot of time researching the history in America and the experience of people of color, and learned a lot. And by the same token, I hired artists that I thought would be relatable to the students. So except for one, they were men of color, and they went in and did a series of rotations with drumming, beat making, poetry, art making, and so on. So it was really centered towards boys. And we had 20 boys per middle school, so 120 boys. And that first year, we saw incredible results in the dropping of suspension and expulsion rates. So we knew we were doing something effective. So again, it was like tailoring the arts experience, using the arts as a vehicle to make positive changes for boys. And again, this was well before Black Lives Matter. So I don't want to say arts is ahead of the curve, but I think it kind of is, because it can do many things we can't traditionally do as teachers, as social workers, as policemen, police people, and so on. So it's very interesting how the arts works. And one more example is the arts in juvenile hall. So when I first got to Riverside County, I had done a lot of work in alternative education. I said, what do we have? And we oversee the educational programs in the juvenile halls. And I had never been into one before 4 years ago. And it was pretty grim. And I called up somebody that I knew had experience working in San Quentin, and she's a very talented artist. And so I got her working there. She was there for 3 years plus. And even when the pandemic happened, she went right to Zoom. And so she would be Zooming in from her studio with the young people. But she really had developed a bond with them and really was interested in showing them a path forward, because being there is really unbelievable. And we tend to have these halls off far away from things. So they're kind of out of sight, out of mind. But sending artists in is really important. And I currently have 2 artists that are interested in working in those settings. And so, I want them to go in and create light and hopefulness, because we really need to care about what's coming next, like what happens to these young people, and what are they going to be ready for when they come out. So I do see a real intersection between things that are happening in public education, the arts, and public health. And so I named, like public art, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, what's happening with incarcerated youth. Those are all things that matter in both sectors, in both education and in health. So my overarching points, I think, to all of this, and I was so glad to be asked to do this talk because it really made me think about it, is the first reason that the arts in our public schools are incredibly important is creating that equity, which means that every student, regardless of what school they go to or what grade they're in, are having an arts experience. And so Prop 28 is really the funding piece that we've been waiting for, because it's part of our education code that students receive the arts all through their career, but it hasn't been mandated. Also, there's an equity piece, because how can you become a professional artist if you're not trained? And if you don't see an art class until you're in high school, then you're just not going to be ready. Also, really working with teachers to move away from the Western canon as an exclusive way of showing the arts, so that we're having more African-American art forms, more Latinx art forms, and so on. So this ties back to arts as a profession and arts as culture, history, and connectors, which was that piece I was referencing, the philosophical foundation and lifelong goal. Get my clicker to work here. The next thing that I feel really strongly about is having the arts in our schools is a quality of life issue, both at the time our students are enrolled and beyond. And I shared my own experience after my child's illness. I feel that the arts really saved me and kept me together. We are healing, all of us, from a collective trauma. And so how much can the arts help us process this in our educational life? It's also really incredibly important when we're struggling to re-engage teachers and students with getting back to school. So having those arts, those fun, joyful pieces that we weave through the day are really important now more than ever. And this ties back to the philosophical foundation and lifelong goal, which is the arts as well-being, and also my point about engagement. We need that engagement. And finally, identity and community. So I feel very strongly that the arts is not just for the wealthy and the talented, it's for everyone. We are concerned with the actual art making. As I told you earlier, we are wired to behold art and to make art. So the actual doing is the thing, not the result. It might be amazing, it might be okay, that doesn't really matter. And when we're playing, like say we're dancing or we're acting, we are actively learning, and it lights up many more parts of our brain when we're doing the arts than if we're just doing something very simplistic and one note, just, you know, a worksheet or what have you, or a lecture. So it really helps with second language acquisition to have students involved in the arts and playing and learning. And it's very redemptive for alternative education and students who are incarcerated, as I mentioned previously. And this ties back to the philosophical foundations and lifelong goals around communication and also around creative personal realization. The talk that I was giving, that particular meeting, they were highlighting LGBTQ plus youth. And so I have some images from our Lavender Prom that Riverside County held. And, you know, really as an educator, and I also think this holds true for the people that were working in public health that I was speaking to, is, you know, in education, we are trained and bound to like and support all children, regardless of our personal beliefs. So we are not a government agency. So our religious bias is not to come into play in the work that we do. And unfortunately, the depression and suicide rates in queer youth are sky high. It's really quite alarming. And I would reiterate that identity of a person or persons is not obscenity. And here's some top line statistics that I pulled just before I gave the presentation, which suicide is the second leading cause of death amongst young people. And LGBTQ youth are at significantly increased risk. In fact, 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their peers. So that is an upsetting and frightening statistic. And here is a video, in their own words, from a student who was part of our 1 Minute Fresh Film Festival, giving their take on this. So a powerful message from one of our students in Riverside County. There we go. And so in reflecting and possibly discussing what I presented just now, on a personal note, I would ask myself, where were the arts present in my own education? Like, what's your art story? And also, how do the arts continue in your life today? And in your sphere of influence, whatever it is, a teacher, a parent, an administrator, how can I use arts in a positive way? And then this was the group discussion with the public health folks, which is, you know, how can we come together and use both our forces for good, right, to make things better. And that is my presentation, and I invite you to contact me if you have questions or comments. And here is my LinkedIn profile. Thank you so much for tuning in.